So I just use my hands. Yeah, many of them are.
Testing. Good evening. Welcome to the Grosse Pointe Central Branch. I'm David Lamb. I'm running the program for you tonight. Just a few quick announcements. We'd like to know if you have any cell phones, we can silence them at this time. We will be recording this tonight as well.
Does that include me? I guess I
All right. Quick announcement. Next month on the 21st of March, we are going to have another presentation in our historical series. Stephen Brozick from the 82nd Airborne Association will be talking about gliders and paratroops in World War II. And I hope all of you can make it for that as well. Hopefully the weather is as cooperative as it's been tonight. We happen to have the one good night of the month.
We got lucky. Although we're fighting a Michigan game tonight, right? Are you all Michigan State fans?
Yes.
We got lucky.
All right.
Sunday they play Michigan.
Greg Sumner here is the co-chair of the Department of History at the University of Detroit Mercy, where he has taught since 1993. Dr. Sumner has a PhD, is chair of the history at the University of Detroit Mercy, where he has taught since 1993. Dr. Sumner holds a PhD in American history from Indiana University and a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. He holds a doctorate in American history from Indiana University, has been awarded summer fellowships by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and has twice been William J. Fulbright Senior Lecturer at the University di Roma Tre. He is also a fellow of the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. His previous books include Unstuck in Time, A Journey Through Kurt Vonnegut's Life, and novels, and Detroit in World War II. And with that, here's Dr. Sumner.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for coming tonight in this beautiful library. I drove by it, I thought, well, that must have been built in 1926. And they said, no, 2006. They did a beautiful job on that. So it's wonderful to be here, and you're my people. My first comment always is, this is a lot different than my day job, which is standing in front of 19-year-old college students, nurses and architects and engineers and business majors, and trying to get them interested in the Marshall Plan or Wilson's 14 points. You know, it's a big. I have to do a lot of heavy lifting in the daytime.
Yeah.
This is great, and I love coming around and speaking to adult audiences. But we do have a problem, and I notice there aren't many, super young. This is a young crowd. But we don't have, young people today, I think, are more historically illiterate than they've ever been, I think. And I don't know why that is, if it's how it's taught, or I think people have to model a love of history. If I have a class of 35, say, I'll have 5 or 6 that know a lot of history, and it's because their parents took them to Civil War battlefields, or watch the History Channel with Dad back when the History Channel actually had history on it, And I have to say, I blame a lot of the problem, why they're not so interested in history. You have to convince them. I blame a lot of it on this. They're on these all the time.
Yeah.
So, it's hard to get them to turn those things off, for an hour class or whatever. So technology is neutral, but I'm preaching to the choir in here. And it's a delight to be here, but we need to get the word out to young people how they need to know what their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents were doing. And, World War II is particularly interesting, but I have to say, I have students, they barely know what Pearl Harbor was, let alone, oh my God, a date, December 7th, 1941. I make them learn that date. And these are college students, so they're very bright, and they can run circles around me technology-wise, but we need to get them interested in history. Well, David outed me in a couple of ways. One is I am a recovering lawyer, as I describe myself, and so I got into teaching, and I love it. And the second thing that I don't know if it's a confession or a disclaimer, but I am not from Michigan. I'm not even from Detroit. I am a Hoosier from Indianapolis, Indiana, up there writing books on Detroit in World War II and Michigan POW camps. I've been here 25 years. Pat, give me a map test. I know where Zug Island is and Roseville, and now I know where every place. I know every little town and every little nook and cranny in the state of Michigan. And I even made my one and only trip to this place called the Upper Peninsula. That's a long way. And somebody told me that there was a guard tower from a German POW camp up there in kind of ruins. So I was on my search for the Holy Grail. I went to the beautiful, bustling town of Sidnaw, Michigan. And should I tell you if I found it or not? I'll keep that as a little spoiler for you. But, you know, I'm a Hoosier, and this is a very interesting place to live. Coming over here, I was driving on 8 Mile, and I went past this street called Gratiot Avenue. I lapse into that. Sometimes I introduce movies way on the west side. Nobody ever goes to the west side, do you? There's a movie theater called the Redford Theater, and it has the organ that comes up and down, and I do the 50-50 raffle occasionally. It's on this street called Lasher. Livernois, all these French names I can't quite figure out. Who's been to the Redford, by the way? Oh, good. You made the trek all the way over there. And one other thing I just have to say, as a person from Indianapolis, my Hoosier brain cannot get around this idea that you drive south to go to Canada. I just never will figure that one out. But it's great to be here and to talk about my new book. This is actually my second book with a local history press called the History Press. And do they still have bookstores here on the east side? Is there a Barnes & Noble at least somewhere?
Closed.
Amazon, of course, is going. They do local histories. They're based in South Carolina. I thought I'd talk about how I started to write this book on the prisoner of war camps in Michigan, and then talk about it a little bit. And I've got a little slideshow of images from the book. And then I've already talked to some people. We have a love story about Italian prisoner of war. We have a woman who remembers the Germans in Ionia County. We have people coming out of the woodwork who know this story. And actually either, if not for your father coming here, you might not be here. That's right. Robert. How many of you knew, by the way, that Michigan had prisoner of war camps during World War? Look at this. Half of you knew about it, which is not the norm. So I'm going to definitely save time at the end, for questions. I want to hear people's stories, if you'd like to share them with us tonight. That's the most fun part for me. And then I go back and I use these stories. Anyway, I got a call about 5 years ago now from the History Press. I'm sitting in my office, and the guy says, "Yeah, we do local history, and we have books on World War. We have a book on Baltimore and World War II. We have a book on Pittsburgh and World War II. Would you like to write a book for us on Detroit?" And before he finished the sentence, I said, "I'll take it." You mean the Arsenal Democracy? I get to write a book about that?
Yeah.
And they let me, it's such a great story. And so I researched it, I talked to lots of people, and I learned about all aspects of Detroit during the Second World War, and here's the book that came out of it. And they liked it, and I liked it, and it was fun, and I've talked about it around Rosie the Riveter, the Warren Tank Arsenal, Willow Run, Hank Greenberg, rationing, movie theaters. Did you know there were over 100 movie theaters within the city of Detroit during World War II? This place was jumping, and it was, one of Detroit's great moments. And I would say about this idea, this cliche of the arsenal of democracy, people have heard about that. It's bigger than you thought. It's even bigger than you can imagine. The amount of planes that were produced, the amount of tanks. Detroit, more than any other city, contributed to winning that war through production. And so I enjoyed writing this. And then they said, "Do you have any other ideas for a local?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I do." I noticed in writing this first book on Detroit in World War II, I discovered there were these Italian prisoners of war at Fort Wayne, down by the river, and also at the state fairgrounds. And they were kind of shuttled back and forth. I said, let me look into this. I discovered there were about 6,000 POWs, Germans, mostly Germans actually, and also Italians who lived in Michigan between the years 1943 and 1946. They didn't get to go home on VE Day. It took a long time, a lot of red tape. It was hard to get back. But I discovered it was part of a national program, that there were over 500 camps nationally, and about 425,000 Germans and Italians who were brought to the States. And most people, not in this room, but most people don't know anything about it. And so I said, how about if I write about Michigan's camps? There were 32. They were mainly processed through Fort Custer, over by Battle Creek in Augusta, Michigan. And they were sent out to camps all around the state to do agricultural labor for the most part. Although the Italians did all kinds of city jobs and worked in parks and on roads and stuff like that. They said, that's an interesting topic. 6,000 Germans, Italians, 32 camps all around the state of Michigan. And I did give you that handout, right? And you don't use that map as a road map. It is not to scale. But it gives you a rough idea. And I have a slide of, they were distributed all over the country. And why was I interested? I'm interested in the human stories, there are a million books on World War II. I just am interested in telling people's stories. And this is a good one. They made an effort to weed out the bad guys. There were bad guys. There were true Nazis and fascists and bullies and violent people, and they tried to weed those guys out, the War Department, and did a pretty good job and got them out to high security places out in Colorado, far west. Most of the guys in Michigan were operating under minimum security. They mostly behaved. They were mostly glad to be here and out of the war. And we treated them very, very well, for the most part. And we followed the Geneva Convention. We might have been the only country that followed the Geneva Convention during World War II. I know our ally, Uncle Joe, was not following the Geneva Convention. You know that the Soviet Union was our friend for 4 years. We needed them. So it's a good story. It's something that the country could be proud of. It represents the ideals that our boys were fighting for. It's different times, than today. And also, the other part of the story that I love is there were strict rules against fraternization. No fraternization with these prisoners. They're enemy combatants, be careful. Well, there was fraternization all the time. Human beings, when they hang around each other, get to know each other, get to care about each other, and know each other as human beings. So there are a lot of really great stories about how Germans, I talked to a lady, Emily Foster, over in Berrien County. Is it Berrien County? She had 3 summers where German prisoners, she was 12 years old, came to her orchard farm. And those guys were like big brothers to us, and they were like family. And after the war, when they went back, they continued to write to us. We stayed in touch. They came back. A lot of the prisoners eventually either found a way, maybe they married an American girl, which did happen, or found a sponsor, a church, or an individual, or the family that they perhaps worked for to help them come back to the United States. They became American citizens. Is that a great advertisement for democracy and what we stood for? So it's a really good story, and it's actually quite a moving story. It makes me laugh, it makes me cry, some of the interactions. In the middle of this horrific global war, with a body count of 80 million or something like that, you have, in these remote areas of Michigan for the most part, and in Detroit, nice human stories about people from different cultures kind of getting to know each other and treating each other like family. So I wanted to tell that story, and they let me do it, and I gathered the pictures, and I got to interview people, and I went to the UP. I have not been to all 32 camps. I've been to about 28 of the sites. Go ahead and ask me a question. Did you know, for instance, I know everything of every little town in Michigan. Did you know that Fremont, Michigan is the baby food capital of the world?
Yeah.
You did know that?
Yeah.
Gerber, a German family, by the way.
Gerber.
I got a whole bunch of little factoids like that, and so I did this tour of Michigan. Not much remains physically of most of the camps. A lot of them were sub-camps, very temporary. Men were brought in for the harvest, the sugar beet harvest, or to work in the orchards in the fall, or to cut trees. They lived in camps. They lived in, sometimes in military facilities. They lived in, they had all kinds of situations in which these guys were held. They even lived, some of them, the Germans at Sidnaw, 2 hours west of Marquette, lived in a former CCC camp. Raise your hand if you know what the CCC was, the Civilian Conservation Corps, kind of a barracks setting. So I've been to most of the camp areas, and I've found some artifacts, and I've talked to people. It's a great story. I believe in the story, and I enjoy telling the story. Well, let's start with the beginning. 1943 is really the year, and I tell my students, we could have lost World War II. You know, the United States was very late in the game, and the bad guys were winning. They were at the gates of Moscow in 1941. England was hanging on by a thread. We really started to turn the thing around, I think, in 1943. And our first big victories against the Germans and the Italians was in North Africa, Operation Torch and what followed. And by May of 1943, we had defeated Rommel. We had defeated the Germans and Italians in North Africa, and we're ready now to move on to Sicily in Italy. That'll be a piece of cake, right? No, it was very... And then eventually the big show, you know, the landing at Normandy. And you know. So we have success, we have victory in 1943 in May, but we got a big victory brings problems. We had hundreds of thousands of prisoner of war, prisoners we captured in North Africa, out in the desert. Germans and Italians, I think they were expecting maybe 60 to 70,000 prisoners would be taken if things went well. We had over 225,000 prisoners, Germans and Italians. They were held in open-air stockades, very temporary housing. It's not very sand fleas. They're out in the open. Where are we going to put these guys? What are we going to do with all of these? We got to find some kind of permanent solution for where to put them. I give the credit for the POW program to a man who should be, I don't think he is, he should be a household name today, George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. I see some people nodding. Imagine his job. President Roosevelt said, General Marshall, here you go. Go win World War II. The Pacific and Europe. Yes, sir. Okay. He had a busy, but he kept his desk clean at the end of every day. George Marshall came up with the idea. He said, look, we need a place to put these guys, and it has to be safe and secure. We follow the Geneva Convention. They're going to be safe and everything. We need a place to put them, and why don't we ship them to the United States? We got a heck of a labor shortage over there, especially in the agricultural field. There aren't enough hands. You know, crops are rotting in the fields over there in places like Michigan and Arkansas and in America. He came up with the idea. The idea was we had these Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, taking men and materiel to the war zone. And they were coming back kind of empty. And he said, let's load the guys onto these ships. Let's begin to bring them over. And we'll send them around the country. And under the Geneva Convention, they can work. And they can even get paid a little bit. And we're not going to torture them or force them to do this. It's a classic case by George Marshall of Yankee ingenuity, killing two birds with one stone. And for the most part, it worked beautifully. So they started to round these guys up. They send them to Casablanca, and then they started to cross the Atlantic, and that was a very tough journey for these 200,000 Germans and Italians. Most of them were tankers, and they were Afrika Korps infantry, Panzer Grenadier. They were pilots. They weren't used to being on the high Atlantic in the middle of the war, and these Liberty ships were not built for comfort. So they're crammed like sardines with the bunks, 4 or 5, 6 high, and they got to go up on deck for maybe an hour a day. And it's a very perilous journey, and they didn't quite know where the heck they were going. You know, they'd been told, you're going to be tortured, you're going to be summarily executed by the Americans if you give yourself up. They didn't quite know where they're going. They don't know whether they can trust these guys, these Americans. But they made it, and it was a zigzag, too, because you had U-boats. And they remember that journey to wherever they're going. coming back across the Atlantic. Very arduous, very stomach churning, bit of an ordeal. And they get off the ships. They landed in Boston Harbor, they landed in New York Harbor, most of them, and Newport News, the major harbors on the East Coast. And, they went through, they were deloused again. They were tagged, they were interviewed, they checked their paperwork, they were issued fatigues that said PW all over them, and they could keep what was left of their uniforms. And wherever the camp it was that they would be assigned, they could wear their uniforms on the camp, but whenever they were outside of camp, they had to wear this uniform that had PW stenciled all over it. It's interesting, by the spring of '44, you got 30,000 a month coming over and landing in New York, Boston, and Virginia, and arriving. And it's kind of funny, they tried to keep it secret from the American civilians, It didn't work. People showed up, they wanted to gawk at these guys, they're throwing candy bars. Hey, Hans, how you doing? Hey, Alfredo, they're people, you can't keep something this big secret. But I think when those guys landed, particularly the Germans, were shocked when they arrived in New York Harbor. Have you seen New York Harbor? It's impressive to anyone. To them, it really was. Because they had been told New York had basically been destroyed by the German superweapons. Hitler, it's a smoldering rubble heap and a ruin. And they looked around, doesn't look like we've even touched it. And there's a lot of activity. I think when they landed in New York, Boston in particular, that's when they began to realize, we might not be winning this war. This country seems to be untouched, by our super weapons or whatever. They were loaded onto trains with bars on the windows, Pullman cars. And they got on board and they didn't quite know where they were going. They were shipped westward. At first, most of them were shipped to the south and to the southwest, Texas and Louisiana and Arizona. And the idea was you don't have to heat buildings down there in wintertime. But the Great Lakes states, including Indiana and Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan, we need some workers too. They were a resource. So they began to send them over to the Midwest and the Great Lakes as well. And I'm sure when those guys started going through like New Jersey, the first thing that happened, I have a quote from Klaus Conrad, who was an officer who was riding on this Pullman train. So the first thing that's happened is we sit down and these black guys get on these porters and start serving us donuts and coffee. And what a great country, What is this? I'm sure, particularly the Germans, but also the Italians, as they're going through New Jersey to wherever they're going, I read these books by Karl May. Where are the buffalo? Where are the Indians? Where are the cowboys? They didn't know. They're still a little bit nervous. They make a long journey, and even just to go from New York to Chicago or Detroit is a long trip. They never understood, they were shocked by the scale and size and vastness of America. I don't think they ever quite figured out. One of the Germans said, I thought they were just taking us around in circles, trying to mess with us. It takes a long time. The first Germans, first POWs arrived. My students hate this, that I remember dates like this. September 27th, 1943. The first Germans, about 270 Germans, arrive in the middle of the night in Benton Harbor, Michigan. From Camp Sheridan, which is up by Chicago. They came by train and they had about 70 guards. And it was supposed to be kept secret and no fraternization, and the entire town of Benton Harbor was out in the middle. Look at these guys. It was a little bit of a test. Let's see how it works. They did a very good job. They helped with the fruit crop. They worked in the Heinz and the Welch's plants, and they also worked for individual farmers. They put ads in the paper. If you're a farmer and you need help for the harvest, you can get a minimum of 10. You have to pick them up in your truck. You have to take them back at night. You have to make sure they have safe working conditions. You have to pay the U.S. Treasury for their services, and they're going to get paid. But individual farmers also could hire these guys. And it worked out beautifully, actually, in Benton Harbor, the kind of pilot program. They didn't cause trouble. They worked hard. They were in the trucks waving at people, whistling at people. They were not bad. So then they tried a place called Cairo, Michigan. I've been there. I think it's in the thumb. Am I right? Where does the thumb start? Is Romeo in the thumb? This is something I also don't understand. Where does the thumb begin? This is still fall. This is okay. Worked in Benton Harbor. Let's try Cairo, and we got a crop called sweet. What do you call it? Sugar beets. Michigan sugar beets.
Croswell.
What's that?
Croswell.
And Croswell too. Cairo and Croswell was a little bit later, but yeah, Michigan sugar, etc. And they again did a very, very good job. And Michigan sugar beets were in very high demand during World War II because cane sugar was heavily rationed and barely available in many cases. Some of you know this. Can I pause for a second and give you a little poem that's in my first book on World War II in Detroit? There was a columnist named, it's about rationing, a little poem, by Walter Winchell. He was a syndicated columnist all through the country, and he wrote a little poem about rationing during World War II, and it's connected to what I'm talking about. Let's see if I can remember. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, remember? See, and apparently sugar beet harvesting is hard work. You got to top them, and they complain it's kind of backbreaking work. Cairo worked out, and they said, okay, let's start bringing them in. And so by the spring of '44, they're pouring in. At one time, Fort Custer had 5,000 Germans living there, and they were shipped around to various camps. And that map gives you a general idea of where they went. Some of the guys cried when they got to Custer and saw these picnic tables with plates and utensils. And they got to eat, and they'd lost weight in the desert, started putting back on weight, and they didn't know if they were going to be killed. And some of them cried, "We're going to live, and it's going to be okay." They couldn't believe the abundance with which they were treated. Now, I have to say, not everybody was very pleased to have the German and Italians in their midst. And I certainly understand that. These are enemies, by the way, at the time in warfare. And by the way, I don't talk about the Japanese. First of all, there weren't many Japanese prisoners of war. Secondly, very few were brought to the United States. And thirdly, that war was a whole different ballgame. I believe the fact that so many people in Michigan, there are so many German-descended people, my gosh, as well as so many Italians in Detroit and in the UP, people who worked in the mines. You had people ready to welcome them who could maybe speak their language, and that made it a lot easier. The Japanese were not the same kind of situation. But I've gone around the state, and I have read little newspapers from World War II in every little town. And always in the letters to the editor, you see, what is it? We're coddling these guys, These are enemies. And I got a brother who's a prisoner of war over in Germany, and another one who's in Guadalcanal in a ditch somewhere. And how come we're treating these guys so well? I see that word coddling. Actually the word, and I use this word now, my students think I'm nuts, mollycoddling. We are mollycoddling these enemy combatants. Well, actually, and you can see from the pictures, it's very Spartan conditions, and I don't mean that in a Michigan State kind of way. Very basic. They got plenty, they had food, and there was a congressman who went around shooting his mouth off. Well, I toured these camps, and these Germans are living, it's like the Waldorf Astoria over there at Camp Custer. Not true. He got a few headlines. I would say they were treated with very basic, it was pretty primitive, actually. But they were quite pleased. They worked hard. Every camp had to have a double ring of fencing. It was minimum security, though. Where are they going to escape to? Tell me, if you're in the UP, in Camp Sidnaw in February, and you've got this, you don't speak English, you're in the middle of the trees, and you have PW marked all over. Where are you going to go, exactly? There were a few escape attempts, and I'll talk about those. Most of them were kind of laughable. Mollycoddling. Every camp had to have a double ring of fencing. Had to have guards. I'll tell you about the guards in a minute. And every camp had to have an infirmary, you know, it had to have certain conditions, it had to be clean and safe, access to water and facilities and all that. And the prisoners did the work and worked in the mess hall. The Italian mess kitchen was very popular among the American personnel, particularly very popular, you know, better than the other
Cooks
food.
in Europe.
And every camp, by the way, also had to have a canteen of some sort, and also had to have a rec area, however primitive, even some of the tent camps. And usually that meant maybe a ping pong table or a card table, you know, something to do for these young guys who were mostly homesick, 19, 20, 21-year-old Germans and Italians, missing home, worried about what's happening back home. They're full of energy, and you know what the number one recreation of these guys was il calcio, football, soccer. I mean, oh my God, it's like a religion for these guys. And camps would play each other. They had big, very high level of soccer. Can you imagine Germans and Italians and a smattering of other Europeans in their population? Sometimes the townspeople would come out and watch soccer matches between rival camps. It happened in the UP. And so they had to have, and they, for their work, according to the Geneva Convention, they were paid up to 80 cents a day. And they could work a maximum of 10 hours and 6 days a week. And again, it had to be safety and all that. Now they didn't say, Alfredo, here's your you know, $3 for the week and give you cash. They gave you coupons or script redeemable at the camp canteen. And you could buy candy bars, and you could buy the good cigarettes, you know, the Lucky Strikes. And you could buy writing paper and various things. You could even buy at Fort Custer beer. Is this a great country or what? The Germans couldn't believe it. And, you know, they spent their money as quickly as they could. You know, they didn't save it up or anything. 3-2 beer, and rationing and all that. 1 per customer. But believe me, that was violated all the time. And of course, the Italians were making grappa under the barracks floor at Fort Wayne and the State Fair. The Germans were making schnapps and stuff like that. And guess what? They were sharing it with the guards. There was a lot of fraternization between the guards and the prisoners. What can I say about the guards? To be a security person at a camp in Sidnaw, Michigan in the middle of World War II was not a high-profile, high-status job. They tended to be older guys, maybe a little bit of belly. They like to take naps. Maybe they're ruled unfit for combat one way or another. They're not the crack, spit, and polish guys, okay, for the most part. And, you know, they gambled with the prisoners, and they covered for each other. When the guard took a nap, I read about Gerd Lindemann, who was an Africa Corps officer, said, we noticed these guys guarding us were not spit and polish. He reported directly to Rommel, and he's out here at Camp Allegan. You know where Allegan is? Allegan, Michigan, Fruit Belt of Michigan. He said, we noticed for one thing, when they talked to their officers, their hands were in their pockets, you know.